As Kyra mentioned, we today we have the opportunity to discuss a recently conducted KBC funded project here at Kansas State, in which we were able to evaluate a lot of the quality traits of some of these ground beef alternatives that have come to market here in the recent years in comparison to ground beef. And so we're going to discuss this in depth and kind of give a brief overview of everything we did and some of our key findings within that study. First off, I do want to make mention is that there's a big, large team here at Kansas State that made this project possible. We had faculty in both animal science as well as within vet med that were responsible and involved with this project. We had numerous graduate students, both again in animal science and vet med. One special student that I want to highlight is Sam Davis. Sam was my master's student who actually did this project for his thesis project for his master's degree here at Kansas State. Sam graduated this past May. He's moved on to a career, but most of the work that we're going to present is all the direct result of his work. This presentation, the majority of it was actually put together as Sam as part of his defense presentation. So a lot of work went into this project by a whole host of individuals that really made all this possible. So we'll start with just a little bit of background about ground beef and ground beef alternatives. And I know at the last Beef Insights meeting, there was a great amount of information given on these two topics, which I really enjoyed going back. And as I was telling Matt Teagarden when we started, that there was some great information that we were able to actually use out of that Beef Insights for us to be able to go forward with the paper that's forthcoming out of the research that we conducted. And so when we talk about ground beef, I'm sure most people on the call understand the importance of ground beef within the U.S. And when we talk about the beef market. And so it is the most highly consumed beef product in the U.S. And if we actually look at the numbers, that's around 26 pounds per person per year, which is a significant amount of ground beef. And then when we look at where that ground beef is actually coming from, most of it, or a large portion of it, 63% of sales of beef from food service all go back to ground beef. And that makes sense when we think about food service and QSL restaurants such as burger chains of all sorts, that ground beef is the major beef item that's on their menus. When we look at retail, still close to half of the beef sold at retail is ground beef, helping again show the importance of ground beef within the beef market and how important that product actually is. We switch over to talk about these ground beef alternatives. So everything that you're thinking of when we talk about plant-based ground beef alternatives, that's what we're wanting to discuss and focus here. I think one important point is that these are not new concepts. I think sometimes we have a tendency to think of these products based on the number of them that are coming to market as a new trend, and that's really not the case. There's been at least 3 distinctive waves of these ground beef alternatives that have came to market over the last 100 years. That Protos product there that's in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, this is actually what we could identify as the first of these plant-based products that were supposed to imitate meat, and that was developed in the late 1800s. So again, not a new concept by any means. When we started thinking about these products, there was a big wave in the late 80s and early 90s talking about health, and we started seeing more and more of these products come to market. So you can think back to kind of the Boca Burger being one of the original kind of this generation of soy-based plant-based alternatives. Now, one of the key distinct differences of what went on in that iteration of these versus what we're seeing today is that in that second wave and even in the first wave, these products really did target vegetarian consumers. And so consumers that were not consuming animal products were the target market. When we look at today, these modern or contemporary ground beef alternatives that have came to market, many of them are actively targeting beef consumers. Lots of reasons for that. Today, we have more consumers that are participating in a flexitarian diet, so one that is primarily plant-based but allows for a little bit more freedom around eating animal-based products. We also have a lot of consumers that do enjoy, in this foodie world that we live in today with today's consumers, enjoying a variety of food. And so these products that are coming to market today are meant to more closely imitate and hopefully attract and draw ground beef consumers away than just strictly focusing on vegetarian or plant-based consumers. When we talk about the market share of these, I think that the word to describe this is actually growth. When we look at these plant-based ground beef alternatives, in the last year, there's been about a 45% increase in sales of these products year over year. When we look at food service, there's been about a 20% increase in these shares. And the last number on here is the one that is probably the most telling to me, is that by 2027, there's expected to be a 318% growth in this market. So these products are here, and there's an expectation that these products and the demand for these products is just going to continue to grow over the at least next half decade. There's a slide with many of these products that you could go down to the grocery store or to some food service establishments and actually purchase. You see that there's quite an extensive list of these products that are available today. This number is quite a bit grown here over the last 2 to 3 years. When we started this project that we're discussing today and started collecting products in the fall of 2019, really there was only a couple products that were actually available for us to even be able to go and select and utilize. Well, that has changed immensely over the last 2 years in the number of these products that are available within most retail chains. When we talk about these traditional products, I mentioned the Boca burger earlier. That kind of traditional soy-based ground beef alternative that we would have seen in the early 90s that many of you might be more closely familiar with. These were typically used soy or soy proteins as the main protein source within these products. When we talk about many of these modern products, we can use the Beyond Burger, Impossible, and the like. These products are plant-based, but through technology, as it's improved through the years, they've been able to alter the texture of these. They've been able to add things to alter the color of these products, to have them more closely mimic beef products, at least within their own minds, to be able to develop a product that they believe more closely resembles beef, more so than the previous iteration. Many of these products today, they don't actually use soy as the main protein. They have access to be able to use many different types of bean and pea proteins, just to name a couple of the different proteins or protein families that have been used within these products. And so when we look at our objective of the current study, as I mentioned, many of these ground beef alternatives position themselves in the market of being similar or replacements even for ground beef. You can look up recipes, countless recipes online, and see how these products are intended to be used essentially as just as a substitute for ground beef. But to date, especially when we started this study, there had been no studies out there that had actually tested any of these claims. Of course, you can go online and find any number of articles where people do very informal, many times very biased taste panels in small settings and get some anecdotal claims of what these products actually are in comparison to ground beef. But there had really never been a true scientific study to evaluate how similar or dissimilar to ground beef these products actually are. And so that was our main objective. We wanted to essentially evaluate absolutely everything we could about ground beef and these products, to be able to compare them, to be able to hopefully identify where there were similarities, where there were differences between the products. And so we chose 3 different fat percentages of ground beef. Again, as I can say that many of these products position themselves as similar replacements to ground beef, never is there a claim is that supposed to be similar to 90-10 ground beef or 70-30 ground beef. We have previous literature that shows that those two products are very different. And so these ground beef alternatives, which of those, if either, are those products more similar to? And so when we talk about the plant-based alternatives that we actually use within the current study, we selected 3 different ground beef alternatives. What we actually chose was at the time in the fall of 2019, a retail ground beef alternative, one that we were able to actually purchase from local retail chains here within Manhattan. That at the time, again, there was really only one of these modern products that was being sold at retail there. We also had a food service ground beef alternative, a completely different branded product, but one that at the time was primarily marketed through food service channels that we were able to source through food service establishments, predominantly in Topeka and the Kansas City region. And then we also included a traditional ground beef alternative, so a traditional pre-pattied, pre-cooked, pre-formed soy burger that, again, has been on the market for many, many years. And so these were the 3 different ground beef alternatives that we chose to evaluate within the study because we felt like they were representative of the market at the time. What we actually did was, again, we purchased ground beef of 3 different fat percentages, so 70-30 product, an 80-20, and a 90-10 product. We also purchased those from retailers around Manhattan. We actually have 15 different production lots of all these different products. And what I mean by different production lots is we didn't just go to the grocery store and buy the first 15 chubs of 80-20 ground beef that was available. We actually spaced that out through time in order to be able to get variation in production day, hopefully production facility. And we're able to monitor that. It took us about a 2 to 3 month period to get all these products selected. We did the exact same thing with the ground beef alternatives. And so we, through time, were able to get representative lot numbers and production to be able to give us some good replication. You can't just say we had a bad batch of any of the products we had. We made sure that we had replication through time of all these different products. Once we got all the products here to Kansas State, what we did is we had froze them at the time that we purchased them to keep them in a fresh state. We thawed all those products out, and then using a hand press, we made them into 1/4 pound patties, which we utilized for all the analyses that we're going to discuss. So we're going to discuss some of these different assays that we did. The first of which was we did a consumer taste test. And so for us, this is always a gold standard for evaluating eating quality of meat products. What I mean by a consumer taste test is we just went here in Manhattan and found 120 people who were regular ground beef consumers, and we invited them to participate on this panel. They got paid a little bit of money for their time for participation, and they got to eat these products over about an hour period and evaluate a whole host of traits, which I'll go into in the next slide. We didn't inform the consumers anything other than this was a panel in which they would be evaluating hamburger patties. We didn't provide any other information to them other than that. So every sample that they evaluated through the lens of this is supposed to be a normal hamburger patty that they would typically consume. We cooked all these patties the exact same. We cooked them all to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, which is what USDA recommends for ground beef. And so all 6 of the different treatments we evaluated were cooked and prepared exactly the same. The other thing is that these panelists here, that they ate each of these products in a blind random order. So they knew nothing other than that the 4-digit code that we had on there, that was a random code to identify the sample. There was nothing in there that they could identify it as any of our 6 treatments. They were unaware of what the 6 treatments were. So this should have been as good of a blind representation of the eating quality of these products as we could possibly produce. The things we asked the consumers to evaluate were appearance. So we asked them how much they liked the appearance of the patty once they got it. And then many of the eating characteristics. So juiciness, tenderness, texture, and mouthfeel. Overall flavor liking. So the overall flavor of the product, did they like the flavor or not? Specifically beef flavor liking. We asked them to focus on how beefy the product was and how much did they like that beef-like flavor. And then most importantly, overall liking, how much did they like the product overall. Another thing we asked the consumers for each of these traits, we didn't include it in this presentation for brevity, but we asked the consumers yes or no, or each of these samples acceptable for each of these traits. So maybe it's a flavor that you didn't really like, but it was still acceptable. Or maybe it was a little tough or dry, but it was still acceptable. That was captured as well. But that data actually mirrored our rating data very closely. Excuse me. The other analysis we did was what we call a trained sensory analysis, or this is an expert sensory analysis. And so this is a group of faculty and graduate students within our department who we go through a training process to evaluate products, to evaluate them in as close to an objective manner as possible. What I mean by that is that we'll all eat these products together ahead of time in a training session and discuss what we think it should be for juiciness or tenderness. So everyone's opinions get dropped at the door, and our whole goal is to be exactly the same on how we actually evaluate each of these traits. And so we did the exact same thing for these trained panel, for this expert taste panel, as we did for the consumers, and many of the same traits. We did add a couple other things in there. This trained sensory panel evaluated the odor of these products. We also evaluated the appearance, both of a cooked appearance on the product under some white lighting as opposed to these red lights. But if you see in the bottom left-hand corner, when this expert panel actually tried and ate all these products, it was under these red lights to help additionally mask any differences in appearance between the products. The traits that were evaluated by this panel, again, were many of the same traits that our consumers or our untrained panelists evaluated: tenderness, juiciness, multiple measures of flavor, including off flavor, so any flavor that will be non-characteristic of a traditional beef, ground beef patty, texture, and then the 2 color traits as well as the odor. Additionally, to go along with our panel data, we measured several objective measures. So these were all measures that we were able to do with some equipment and various machines and assays that we have within our lab space to evaluate these traits. So we have a measure on here of shear force, which is a mechanical measure of tenderness. The middle one there, pressed juice percentage, is a mechanical measure of juiciness. Texture profile analysis, which we were able to measure how tough or springy a product actually is. Color. And then one of the unique things that we measured was all of us that have cooked ground beef patties. This next weekend on the 4th of July, you put your ground beef patty on the grill, and as it cooks, many times they'll shrink up in size, and so the diameter changes. Sometimes they get a little thicker, sometimes they get a little thinner. That's a characteristic that all of us are familiar with ground beef. And so we measured all those same traits within these ground beef alternatives. We were interested to see what their shape and look changed throughout cooking that typically occurs within a ground beef patty. So we're going to move into some of the results here. We're going to start with our consumer results, and then we'll go to the rest of the eating quality and end with some of the objective results. And so all these figures that we're going to show are all essentially set up the exact same way. On the left-hand side, we have a scale for all of these traits that we're evaluating. The bottom, or 0, is actually the negative end of the scale, and then the 100 end, or the higher the bar, the more positive end of the scale. And so the way these bars are set up, the 3 on the left-hand side are our 3 ground beefs. As you can see, it goes from the 90-10 to the 80-20 to the 70-30. And then on the right-hand side are our 3 ground beef alternatives. Again, our retail ground beef alternative, food service ground beef alternative, and then the traditional ground beef alternative. So when we looked at these results, there was really 3 things that we tried to evaluate. First and foremost, most importantly, how did the 3 ground beef compare to the 3 ground beef alternatives? And many times they are exactly the same and they tell a good story. Secondly, we had 3 very different ground beef alternatives, and we cared very much about how those compared. Was it essentially one ground beef alternative was the same as the others, or were there differences? And then lastly, and for the sake of this presentation, least importantly, how did our 3 ground beef actually compare to each other? And so this first result here is our consumers and how much they actually like the appearance. I do want to also point out, this is an important thing for interpreting these graphs, is that 50%, so that midline on here, in many of our liking scales for the consumers was the cutoff, and we actually verbally anchored that as yes or no, essentially, was the trait liked or disliked for that trait. So our scale, you can see, went with 100 was like extremely, and 0 is dislike extremely. So anything above 50, the consumers told us they liked, and anything below 50, they essentially told us they did not like. So when we looked at appearance liking here, you can see that our 3 ground beefs on the left-hand side all rated higher than the 3 ground beef alternatives on the right. And when we actually, again, talking about appearance, our retail ground beef alternative scored extremely low, down around a rating of 25 and lower than any of the other traits, with our other 2 ground beef alternatives, food service ground beef alternative and the traditional ground beef alternative, being similar, but still lower than our ground beef. When the consumers actually ate the product and evaluated juiciness, we had some stark differences here as well. We had all of our ground beef products, again, were similar, but we did have the food service ground beef alternative get rated for juiciness similar to the 3 ground beef. However, the retail ground beef alternative, and especially the traditional ground beef alternative, were rated extremely dry. If you keep an eye on the traditional ground beef alternative, especially when we move into these measures of juiciness, it was a product that was rated extremely dry by every measure that we actually evaluated throughout the entire study. So again, some differences, especially with the retail ground beef alternative and the traditional ground beef alternative compared back to the ground beef. When you actually ask tenderness, now tenderness is a harder trait for us to evaluate when we think about hamburger patties and ground beef. So tenderness, we all can close our eyes and think about what tenderness means within a beefsteak. It's a little bit harder of a trait when you talk about a common unit or a ground product for consumers to evaluate, because most of these products are all tender, and that is reflected within our study results here. We can see probably more similarities for this consumer rating of tenderness between our 3 ground beefs and our 3 ground beef alternatives as we had within any other measure that we had throughout the entire study. That's not incredibly surprising to us as researchers, as we do know, especially with ground beef, this is a trait that consumers have a tendency to struggle to evaluate. Our train panel did tell us a little bit different story when it relates to this. That kind of matches some of our objective measures a little bit better that we'll talk about when we get to that slide. We really start getting into some very large differences in these products when we get to flavor traits. So this is beef flavor liking. So how much did you like the beef flavor component of the products? And we see all 3 of our ground beefs scored incredibly high for beef flavor liking, as we would assume. But when we compared that back to the 3 ground beef alternatives, our consumers rated all those less than 40 on the scale. Again, a few differences there among those 3 products, but very, very low. Essentially, our consumers did not think this product tasted like beef, and they did not like the flavor of it that was supposed to be mimicking a beef-like flavor. So understanding that these products do have a different flavor profile, we did ask about overall flavor liking. So regardless of whether or not that flavor tasted like beef or not, how much did the consumer like the flavor of the product overall? You can see again, our 3 ground beef scored very high, and we're all similar to each other. But again, our 3 ground beef alternatives all scored much lower, again, with the retail ground beef alternative scoring lower than the other 2 products. Of note, if we go back to the previous slide, you would have seen the traditional ground beef alternative actually scored a little bit lower for the beef flavor liking than the other 2 products. But when we compare it back here, even though our consumers essentially said, no, this product doesn't taste like beef, the flavor of that particular product, they were more okay with than the other products when we compared them back. So kind of note there, they're not comparing that traditional ground beef alternative, it appears, to be a product that they consider beef-like, but they were not as opposed to the flavor of it as maybe the other data might suggest. Although I will point out here, again, 50 on this scale was the do you like it, yes or no essential line, and that all 3 of those products have very, very low ratings for flavor, meaning that our flavor, even though that might have been higher than the beef flavor scores, were not liked well overall by our consumers. When we look at overall liking, this is just, again, a trait that is holistic in all things considered. How much did you like the product? Do you like it extremely? Did you dislike it extremely? Again, our 3 ground beef scored close to 60 on that line, and the 3 ground beef alternatives scored incredibly low, less than 40. You can see the retail ground beef alternatives scored way down into the mid-20s on the scale. So within this scale, again, our consumers indicated that they did not like the 3 ground beef alternatives very much, especially in comparison to the 3 ground beef products that they actually evaluated. And so within those consumer results, we actually see that our consumers thought that those products were originally a little bit drier than the ground beef. We saw that our consumers felt that those products had a flavor that they were very different than the ground beef, and probably one that was not liked overall. And then overall liking, we did see that our consumers did not indicate they liked the ground beef alternative. So when we looked at our consumer results, the only place to where the 3 ground beef alternatives were similar at all to our ground beef products were in the tenderness trait, again, which is a trait that is a little bit more difficult for the consumers to evaluate. So we moved over to our trained or expert sensory panel results. What did we find here? A lot of the same things, and a lot of this even a little bit more magnified as we might expect with a trained panel. You will notice throughout this that we were able to find more differences within our ground beef samples, the 90-10, 80-20, and 70-30, than we had within the consumers. Again, not surprising. Sometimes when you look back at published literature, consumers struggle to find differences in fat content, having rating change differences on their preferences for ground beef. But when we compare this to our ratings for the ground beef alternatives, there were significant differences found across the board for these products. We look at here at just juiciness, the same story is told that even our consumers found very, very low ratings for all three of the ground beef alternatives. And I can say, as one of the panelists that ate on these panels, the three ground beef alternatives were all incredibly dry, especially the traditional ground beef alternative, especially compared back to the three ground beef that were evaluated. Tenderness, you actually see an inverse effect here. You can see that our train panel, when we actually have our experts that probably tried the products, all three of the ground beef alternatives were rated as more tender than the ground beef samples, perhaps providing a little bit of evidence that these products were quite a bit softer in their texture, which we were able to find within our texture analysis compared back to the ground beefs. Again, something that was harder for our consumers to maybe identify when they have a lot going on in their mouth at the same time and have what we call this halo effect, where they didn't really like the flavor of the product and it was really dry. It was harder for them to independently evaluate tenderness, while our expert panel is trained to be able to separate those traits out a little bit better, and they were able to indicate that those three ground beef alternatives actually were a little bit more tender than the ground beef. So we're talking about beef steaks, tenderness is typically viewed as a positive trait. We are talking about tenderness here of ground beef, and the intention should be, I know these products intend to be able to mimic the ground beef. Well, this gives evidence that the ground beef was actually a little bit tougher than these ground beef alternatives. So again, dissimilar from the ground beef alternatives versus the ground beef. When we looked at the flavor traits within our train panel, we really had some extensive differences. So this isn't beef flavor ID liking, how much did we like the beef flavor? This was on a scale of how much did it actually taste like beef? And to no surprise, the three ground beef scored incredibly, incredibly high, close to 90 on the 100-point scale for how much does it taste like beef. And then conversely, our ground beef alternatives scored incredibly low. Those means are all actually closer to 5 to 10. Our expert panel did not think there was any flavor coming from these products that was indicative of beef whatsoever. And then when we looked at how strong that flavor in there was, the first one was, hey, does it taste like beef? Yes or no. Essentially, this one is saying how strong of the flavor that's in there with beef, how strong is that flavor? We see the exact same trend. We see our ground beef alternatives all scoring incredibly, incredibly low for beef flavor intensity compared back to the ground beef, which had a stronger beef flavor within those products. That was to no surprise. When we talk about texture rating, this was a little bit different. We did not ask our consumers this. We only asked our train panelists this. On this scale, 0 is extremely soft, and then 100 was extremely hard. And so similar to the tenderness results, what this gives us a greater indication of is that our ground beef products, all three of them were a lot firmer or more hard in their mouthfeel compared back to the ground beef alternatives, all of which were incredibly, incredibly soft. Which has resulted in the previous tenderness differences that we saw a couple slides ago. So again, evidence that these ground beef alternatives, all three of them, actually were quite a bit softer than the ground beef. When we asked the panelists about off flavors, so for us, these off flavors are defined as any flavor that was in that product that we would not typically characterize associated with normal beef. So if we were doing a traditional panel, beef off flavors sometimes include maybe like a gamey or a grassy flavor, or perhaps a livery flavor. These are words that we would typically, if we were just doing a beef study, these panelists, obviously we had large intensities of other flavors. When we asked the panelists how they described these different off flavors associated with these, for both the retail ground beef alternative and the food service ground beef alternative, those were described as a bean-like flavor, a fermented bean-like flavor. And the traditional ground beef, again, this was the product that was a little bit different, that was originally with a soy-based background. A lot of the flavor profiles was more cornmeal-like. Someone actually described it as it tasted like you were at the county fair. So much more of a kind of different flavor than the strong fermented bean type flavors that we got within both the retail and the food service ground beef alternatives. We asked about odor. Again, the first odor that was evaluated was beef odor. How much did these smell like cooked beef? No surprise, we had very high ratings for our 3 ground beef products, and then next to no ground beef odor for our ground beef alternatives. And then for the non-beef odor, it mirrors the flavor very closely. Again, close to no non-beef like odors within our ground beef. But when we hop over to the ground beef alternatives, we had very, very high ratings for kind of non-beef like characteristic odors in there. A lot of the same traits that we talked about, kind of a fermented type odor associated with at least the 2 modern ground beef alternatives within those products. So again, when we get to this point and we look and we talk about all of our sensory panels, so our expert panel as well as our consumers, these products were very, very different, specifically when we talked about how much the consumers like the products, when we talked about the characteristics, when we talk about juiciness, tenderness. Essentially, none of the traits that we evaluated from the taste panel side were similar between the ground beef alternatives and the ground beef products. So the question is, was that just our panel, or did that actually hold true when we actually went to the lab and were able to measure some of these same traits objectively? And what we found is the answer is very much yes. And so shear force, this is a measure of tenderness. So the lower the number here is actually better. So a lower number here indicates a more tender product. When we look and compare the 3 ground beef to the 3 ground beef alternatives, all 3 of the ground beef alternatives were more tender than our 3 ground beef. And this matched up very, very nicely with what we saw within our expert panel, as what we would have expected for those products, just being more tender, requiring less bite force to get through them compared to the ground beef samples. Pressed juice percentage, again, this is an objective measure of juiciness. So higher numbers here indicate a juicier product. And we found the same thing that our panelists found, some differences with the ground beef alternatives all being drier overall than our 3 ground beef. We also, good for us, saw that as we increase fat within the ground beef, we increase the amount of juice, which is not to be unexpected. And then again, I pointed out previously in the presentation that the traditional ground beef alternative was an extremely dry product. And when we went to the lab and we were able to measure it, it had next to no moisture that we could actually squeeze out of it, which is very, very reflective of what our panelists were able to observe as well. Cooking loss. So again, this was a measure of when we cooked the product, how much weight was lost through cooking. We would expect through moisture and fat loss that those products do get lighter and do lose weight throughout cooking. Again, we have greater cook loss when we add more fat to products. So no surprise, our 80-20 and 70-30 ground beef patties lost more weight through cooking than our 90-10. Conversely, all 3 of the ground beef alternatives didn't lose nearly as much weight. They had less cook loss associated with them compared back to the others. And again, the traditional ground beef the traditional ground beef alternative had next to no change in weight as a result of cooking. The other 2 still were very low, both being 12 or less than 10% in terms of weight loss compared to the close to 30% that we had within some of our higher cook loss in the 80-20 and 70-30. Of all the data we had that kind of surprised us the most, this data might have been probably the most enlightening on these products. Again, I mentioned when we typically cook a hamburger patty, we do expect some shrink in terms of the shape of that product through cooking. And so we actually measured the diameter of the raw patty and the diameter of the cooked patty, and the same thing with thickness, the diameter or the thickness of the cooked and raw patty. We're able to calculate how much those products shrank. As you can see, we had, especially in our higher fat products, to no surprise, we had a good amount of shrink that we would typically see and anecdotally know off of our own grills at home that occurred within the ground beef as a result of cooking. When we actually did that to the ground beef alternatives, you can see that there was next to no change in the diameter of these products. And beyond that, the food service ground beef alternative actually increased in diameter through cooking as opposed to shrinking. So to say that these products cook different and change shape and behave differently on the grill than the ground beef, that would be quite the understatement, because these products actually didn't change hardly at all, or in some cases actually got bigger as a result of cooking, as opposed to the traditional shrink that we see within ground beef. Thickness tells the exact same story. So we have we have greater change in thickness or more shrink within our ground beef. And not only the food service ground beef alternative, but the retail ground beef alternative. So the two modern or contemporary ground beef alternatives that we evaluated both actually increased in thickness as a result of cooking. The traditional ground beef alternative did get a little thinner, but the other two actually got a little bit thicker as we cooked, which again is very, very different than what we see within the ground beef products. Cooking time. So I mentioned that we cooked all these hamburger patties to 160 degrees. So we actually measured several factors related to cook time. How long did it actually take us on our grill to get to our endpoint temperature that we pulled these products off at? And then we actually evaluated how long did it actually take us to be able to get those all the way up post cooking rise. When you typically pull a meat product off the grill, it will continue to rise in temperature, sometimes 5 to 10 degrees over a period of time. So we measured all those factors just to compare those between these products. And what you see is that we have, as we increase fat, it took longer for us to actually have these products reach 160 degrees on the grill. Compared that back, our two modern ground beef alternatives were a little bit faster in their cooking, with the exception of the traditional ground beef, which actually took longer than any of the other products that actually cook. The traditional ground beef alternative will cook in some cases, 50% longer to cook than the other ground beef alternatives. Now, this is probably likely explained by the fact that this was a pre-cooked patty that did have less moisture in it. All those things, that the way the thermodynamics in that product actually worked, created it, taking it just in general with less moisture, a longer time to reach temperature than the others, but nonetheless differences between our ground beefs and these ground beef alternatives and the cooking time as well. And then some of the last data here we have is we measured a lot of the measures of color within this, and this is objective color. So this is actually a machine that we're able to put on these patties to be able to measure several different traits. So on here on the left, this is L-star value. This is a measure of lightness or darkness of the product. You can see that we had some changes there. Again, the 0 is dark, 100 is light within that scale. And so you can see that there was some differences, but one of these measures that we care probably the most about is in the middle, which is A-star, which is the amount of redness on the product. And this is on the raw product before we actually cooked it. Redness is typically what we care the most about when we compare ground beef or other beef products. And our 3 ground beef that we had in the study lined up very closely to where we would have expected for this value. One thing to note is there's a pretty big difference between the retail ground beef alternative and the food service ground beef alternative, with the food service ground beef alternative being quite a bit redder than the retail ground beef alternative. Again, these are both the two modern or contemporary ones. That's easy to explain. You go back to the ingredient panels for those products we use. Soy-like hemoglobin was included as one of the ingredients in the food service ground beef alternative, which is an additive that's been approved by FDA for inclusion to these products to allow for them to appear more red in color. And so that was reflected within these raw color values, that our food service ground beef alternative was more red in color raw than our retail ground beef alternative. And then when we look at B-star on the far right, our B-star value is a measure of yellowness. Again, you can see the traditional ground beef alternative, both are B-star being more yellow, and did have a higher A-star value, so a redder product. It was, if I would use a word to describe it, almost a more orange-like color in the raw state than the other two products, which is reflected here in how those color characteristics do come back. We actually cooked these products and then measured the internal cook color of them as well. This was what was evaluated by our expert panel, but also measured here with our instrument. And we did see some pretty significant differences, though there might be some fewer differences in the raw state, especially when we talk about L-star. When we look at L-star, again, a measure of lightness, you can see that the 3 ground beefs actually were a lot lighter in internal cook color, all cooked to the same degree of doneness, than our 3 food service or our 3 ground beef alternatives, which were all similar and a little bit darker. That red color that we had mentioned within the food service ground beef alternative that was present in the raw product on a cooked product, that difference was negligible between the retail ground beef alternative and the food service ground beef alternative for redness. Again, some of those products held and were a little bit redder than our traditional ground beef in the cooked state. And then within B-star, again, a measure of yellowness, we still see the traditional ground beef being a little bit higher. So again, I think the takeaway from all the color data is similar to every other data point that we looked at here. These products were a very different color than ground beef and not very good analogs of those products when we talk about how close they actually matched the ground beef, actual ground beef. So we kind of look at what we learned from this study. I think it was pretty telling. There's not a lot of times you're involved with a research project that produces as cut and dry results as this study did. We measured everything we could possibly imagine from a quality trait standpoint. And these ground beef alternatives that we evaluated differed from ground beef in close to every one of those traits. With few exceptions throughout the entire data, was there a time when we had our ground beef was similar to our ground beef alternatives for anything that we evaluated. We kind of compare the two. Again, to no surprise to us, our ground beef actually did what we expected it to with the varying fat levels. Some cases they were similar, some cases they were different. But what was very interesting is our 3 ground beef alternatives were very different in many of those characteristics. And so especially when we looked at our 2 modern, so the retail and the food service ground beef alternatives compared to the traditional ground beef alternative, there was big differences between those two. But even in the 2 modern or contemporary ground beef alternatives, our food service ground beef alternative and retail differed widely in their quality traits as well. So not all of those ground beef alternatives that are available within these channels are the exact same. So there is significant differences throughout. And so I think one of the things that we try to stress every time we talked about this project and results is that, consumers, retailers, and people who market these products need to consider them as very different from ground beef, that trying to market these products as similar or substitutes for ground beef is really doing a disservice, not just to ground beef, to these products as well. These are very, very different products and need to be considered as such in the marketplace. One thing that is probably interesting to us in looking at this data set is that even though we feel this data is pretty clear and decisive, then especially when we looked at our consumer data, that these consumers were not big fans. They did not like the ground beef alternatives in many cases on many of the scales that we evaluated them in. This completely flies in the face of the data we presented in the early slides in the intro related to demand for these products. We have market shares increasing. We have increased demand for these products. So there's a big disconnect between perhaps what our results in this study show versus what the market signals are saying, that consumers are wanting these products. When we discuss this internally and we discuss this, probably one of the true differences is that in a real world setting, consumers are actually being able to use these as ingredients. So if it is a hamburger patty on a hamburger, then they're including cheese and mustard and mayonnaise and all these other toppings, which go a long ways to masking or covering up some of these flavor differences. Our study, everything was served without any kind of extra seasoning on them. They were cooked all the exact same. And so the products were left to be able to evaluate it on their own merit without any additional changes. In the real world, that's not actually what happens. And so there's some additional research that needs to be done to be able to evaluate how these products actually do in kind of this real world setting, like a consumer would actually use them, to see if these large differences that we were able to identify and capture within this study, if they actually hold true with the way the product's actually used into the real world. And I'll be honest, we got notification earlier this week that NCBA decided to actually fund a project to follow up on this to address that very question. So here in about a year, we'll have some more data related to how these products actually do perform in these real world settings from an eating quality standpoint. And with that, I will take any questions.
Feel free to unmute yourselves at this time and ask any questions that you might have for Dr. O'Quinn. And Dr. O'Quinn, while we're waiting, I have a question for you. Do you have any insight or assumptions on what the actual makeup is of the alternative products? You mentioned like a cornmeal type flavor, or feel like they're at the county fair, were some of the comments they made?
Yeah, no, we do have the ingredient list for all those products because they were included obviously on the packaging. So we have as much knowledge as what was included on those. Again, when we look at, I mentioned that cornmeal type flavor on the traditional ground beef alternative, there was no kind of corn-like products that were included in the ingredients. Probably just a net result of how that soybeans that were processed for those products is what kind of generated that flavor. And so we were limited to our knowledge to what was included in the ingredients list for some of those different products.
Okay, thank you. We do have a question in the chat from Jennifer. Those alternative products, are they meant to be cooked to 160 degrees?
That's a great question. One of those questions in which we had discussions at the very beginning of the research project on how to address that. There are recommendations for some of those products that they should be cooked a little bit lower than 160. Again, probably not necessarily fully supported by what USDA and FDA guidelines actually are. For our study, because we wanted to keep everything on as close to an apples to apples comparison as we possibly could, chose to cook them all to 160. If we allow these to vary to where we cook some of the products to a lower degree of doneness, would they have done different? More than likely, we know that degree of doneness is probably the biggest driver of differences of eating quality. But again, with these products and not 100% being sure, we just followed USDA's recommendation and fully cooked everything to 160.
Okay, thank you for that information. I don't see any questions in the chat at this time, but feel free if you think of something, go ahead and jot that down there, or you can unmute yourself at this time and ask your question as well. Another question I have, Dr. O'Quinn, is what were 3 of the biggest takeaways from this study that you received?
Oh yeah, that's a great question. We've presented this data with our Cattlemen's Day back in March, and subsequently there's been a lot of follow-up news stories that we had done interviews for on the data. And so we had a lot of time to reflect on that. I think that the biggest takeaway for us as a research group was how different these products are than ground beef. We've tried to maintain that every time we've talked about this, that these ground beef alternatives are very, very different products. And so to try and have them essentially, again, be marketed as the same as ground beef is really not true. And so that's probably the biggest takeaway we have. And I think the other thing that was quite surprising to me is that how different the 3 ground beef alternatives actually were. They're obviously all through different companies. And again, when we especially compare the traditional ground beef alternative, I was very shocked, I guess, especially comparing the 2 contemporary, the retail and the food service ground beef alternative, how different those products were in many of the things that we measured. So even though those companies are using similar procedures and with the same level of technology, the products they've created are different from each other. And so something to consider for many consumers, that if they are purchasing these type of products, that they will get different eating experiences based on which brand they are purchasing.
We have a comment in the chat. I see that Impossible Burger says that it's to be cooked to 160 as a recommendation on the package.
Well, that's good. That's one of the many ground beef alternatives that are out there. So I know they don't all label it as to 160. So I think there is some variation within what the recommendations from some of these companies actually are.
Okay, thank you for that. Are there any other questions from our listeners that want to submit via chat or unmute themselves?
Either I did a good job of giving everyone all the information, or I put everyone asleep, one of the 2.
No, I think you did a great job. It was a good discussion and great to hear this information going on in our industry. So I think I'll go ahead and wrap up for today. I want to thank you, Dr. O'Quinn, for presenting to our online participants this afternoon and sharing your expertise in the research findings. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for such an insightful presentation. Thank you for all that you do for the beef community. Lastly, as a reminder, this meeting was recorded and will be housed on the Beef Hub tab on the Kansas Beef website at kansasbeef.org. Have a great rest of your day.